Hello everyone, we are live again. Sorry for the technical glitch that we faced. Good evening and welcome to the fifth session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. I am Ishan and today I am joined by eminent historian Professor R. Mahalakshmi ma'am. She teaches history at Center for Historical Studies JNU and she has researched and wrote extensively on the state structure, rise of Brahmanical and other religious traditions in early medieval South India and Tamil influences in ancient and medieval Sri Lanka. Apart from the reflection of Tamil society in Sangam literature and on the life and works of historian Anand Kumar Swami. She was awarded Professor Hira Lal Gupta Research Award for outstanding research work for her book, The Making of the Goddess. Today, she'll be talking about the social roots of the Tamil Bhakti traditions. Without further ado, I'll now give the floor to our speaker, Professor R. Mahalakshmi ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Karwan as well as to you, Ishan, for inviting me to this series. I think it is commendable that in these very trying times, you are making the effort to organize these talks and to allow us as historians to present our research on different aspects of history to a wide audience through these online discussions. Today, the topic of my presentation is the social roots of the Tamil Bhakti tradition. And what I intend to do is look at the context in which what we understand as the Tamil Bhakti tradition took root in the region, which is the extreme south of the peninsula, broadly covering the Tamil regions and parts of Kerala, as well as the southernmost tip of Andhra Pradesh. So within this broad region, the way in which Bhakti is being expressed in the writings, in the compositions of saints, and how over a period of time these writings and compositions which are composed in the Tamil language find a place within the institutions that are being established by the newly emerging state structure. It's in this sense that I look at the importance of the context rather than merely at bhakti itself, which is a very, very important idea, very important concept. It is known from a very early period, but in a very late text like the Bhagavata Mahatmya, you have this verse which is Utpanna Dravide Saham Vriddhim Karnatake Gata Kvachit Kvachin Maharashtre Gurjare Jeernatam Gata. And then it ends with this line, Vrindavanam Punah Prapya Navineva Surupini. The context is Narada, the sage, the celestial sage, comes across this extremely beautiful woman in Vrindavan, and she seems to be trying hard to revive and to hold up these two very old men. And when he asks her who she is and what this is, who these men are, she tells him that she is Bhakti personified, and these are her two sons, and they represent the Jnana Marg and the Karma Marg, and that they have grown old and weary. But what happens to her is that she is born in the Dravida land. She grows old when she's passing through Karnataka, and in Maharashtra she is moving here and there, and finally she grows very old and withered in Gujarat. And finally, she comes to Vrindavan and she again becomes young. So there is therefore a genealogy that is sought to be built in this very late text. It's an 18th century text. It is understood to be a standalone text which is attached to the final adhyaya of the Padma Puran. And the point behind this genealogy is to declare the awareness of the idea of bhakti, of the concept of bhakti, as being very old and as having traversed a very wide temporal space. So it's in that sense that this is a very, very important starting point. But if we actually go to the start in terms of the kinds of sources that we have, as early as in the Rig Veda, we have the reference to the root of bhakti, the root term, which is bhaja, and over there we have, for instance, the reference in a hymn to Agni as Bhagavat, and Agni as deciding whether to apportion or not to apportion. That is bhakta or abhakta, other terms that are being used. So in the manner in which it is used, the context in which it is used, scholars have argued that there is a material basis, at least in the earliest usage of this term bhakti, where it refers perhaps to the redistribution of resources at the sacrificial site to all the members of the tribe by the leader of the tribe on behalf of the gods to whom the offerings are made. So from that material basis, then there is a transformation over a period of time. And in the Upanishads itself, we find this, this kind of a transformation that is hinted at. For instance, in the Katha Upanishad and in the Mundaka Upanishad, you have references to the grace, the prasada of the Godhead. You have references to Purusha Uttama. And later on, you know, the importance of that term Purushottama in medieval bhakti that emerges. But you have such references that are there in these Upanishads. In the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, you have Shiva Bhakti, which is fully described and amplified. And then you have in a text like the Bhagavad Gita, the dating of all of these texts is well known, although there is controversy about whether we place these within the first millennium BC, or as many scholars have shown, whether a text, for instance, like the Bhagavad Gita should actually be placed around the 2nd, 3rd century AD. Nevertheless, you have in the Bhagavad Gita a full exposition on the idea of bhakti. And then in the second half of the first millennium CE, you have the Bhakti Sutras, which also talk about bhakti as a form of worship, the importance of bhakti. It elaborates on how there are at least 9 ways. For instance, in Narada Bhakti Sutra, you have reference to the 9 ways in which bhakti can be offered. You have Shankara himself, according to legend, who was a great votary of Shaivism, who talks about bhakti. You have the Bhagavata Puran, a text of dated somewhere between the 8th and the 10th century, with its provenance being in South India around Madurai. The Bhagavata Puran also talking about different forms of bhakti. You have various early Purans from the 2nd century CE itself, if not earlier, that are talking about bhakti. And then you have in the 12th, 13th centuries, you have thinkers like Ramanuja, who are also expounding on the philosophy, the concept, the idea of bhakti. So the bhakti itself, if you were to look at it from the perspective of the history of ideas, it has a very long history. It can be dated to the Rig Veda itself, but the manner in which this idea gains meanings and gets transformed in the process is also incumbent then upon the context in which the term occurs. It is in this sense that various scholars like John Stratton Hawley and Friedhelm Hardy and Champak Lakshmi and Indira Vishwanath Peterson have looked at the idea of bhakti. bhakti. Many of them have looked very critically at the idea of a bhakti movement. You know, it's a very common thing, and particularly when you try to draw a lineage, as is drawn in the Bhagavad Mahatmya verse, where you're talking of the movement from the Dravida Desha through Karnataka, etc., there appears to be a temporal movement that is being clearly laid out over there. There is another kind of movement also. So therefore, there's a chronological element in terms of the movement, and there is also a regional element which comes in while discussing the movement. But as Peterson and Champak Lakshmi have argued, there's another way also in which the idea of movement is taken for granted when looking at bhakti. And many of the early scholars looking at Tamil bhakti, for instance, Vaiyapuri Pillai, have talked about the Tamil bhakti movement, of how these saints were actually moving in large numbers from one place to another, from one site to another, and they were proselytizing, and they were bringing these large groups of people and creating the community of bhaktas. So this is something that is there even in the way within a region, the notion of bhakti, or the way in which bhakti is manifested is understood. In a very interesting study of the Bhagavad Gita by D.D. Kosambi, he tries to understand the material context, the historical context in which the Gita is able to express these ideas about bhakti, while also talking about the importance of the Jnana Marg and of the Karma Marg. So the Gita is a text where you have all three margas, and all of these three pathways are seen as leading the worshipper to the object of the worship, the Godhead, or truth, or reality. And in his understanding, he talks about how this text, particularly because it is placed in about the 3rd century, this is a time when you have a relatively peaceful society, relative prosperity, there is agrarian expansion, there is a powerful state. We are talking about the Gupta context, and it is in this context that we can actually see that the Bhagavad Gita is able to talk about all three ideas as having the same kind of value of valence, because this is a society where there is no need for that kind of competition or contestation or conflict. So the Gita is actually able to very effectively bring together very different modes of worship in its articulation. And therefore, when we do look at bhakti in the Gita, we find that it is nestled very comfortably with other ways of knowing the truth or reality or God. Something else that Kosambi talks about, which is very interesting, is the idea of loyalty and devotion that is intrinsic to bhakti. For instance, in the Gita, there are verses which talks about how a person does not need to do anything else. He only has to give himself up completely, totally, unquestioningly to God, and God will accept him and will ensure that he receives moksha, that he receives salvation. So the notion of loyalty, which is unquestioning, which is complete, is seen by Kosambi as being very suited to a new kind of materiality that is emerging, a new kind of social formation that is emerging, where you have landed intermediaries and you have a vast section of subject peasantry, and the message of bhakti, of devotion, of loyalty, of fealty, that this very much suited this new context, which he then goes on to describe as feudalism. In the Tamil region, what we have a couple of centuries later, between the 6th and the 7th century, 6th and the 9th centuries to be precise, is Shaiva and Vaishnava Bhakti in the form of hymns that were composed, saints who are called the Nayanars by the Shaivas and Vaishnavas by the Alvars. These hymns talk about devotion to the godheads Shiva and Vishnu respectively. We have a whole set of texts which belong to a later period, which are separated by at least 4 centuries from the time when these hymns were composed. The hagiographies of the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas, called the Periya Puranam and the Divya Suri Charitam, and thereafter you have a lot of hagiographies which either focus on one particular saint or on a few saints together. So in these hagiographies also then you have a description of the Bhakti tradition, of the Bhakti hymnist, the context in which the hymns were being composed by the Shaiva and Vaishnava saints. We also have as evidence for this period, the early medieval period, the temples that were built on a very large scale, from small cave temples to the structural stone temples of the Pallavas and the Pandyas, and then the great temples of the Cholas from about the 10th century onwards. So really we're looking at a lot of material evidence that is available to us. The temples are endowed with numerous inscriptions, thousands of inscriptions, and these inscriptions record in detail the way in which the Bhakti tradition was very much institutionalized, had taken root in the Tamil region. So these sources then become very important for us to understand and to contextualize the way in which the Bhakti tradition takes root in the Tamil region. Now, when we need to go a little before the early medieval period to really understand why the Bhakti traditions are important for us to understand the nature of change and transformation, not merely in the religious sphere and cultural sphere, but also in the social and political spheres. And this takes us to the early historic period, a period that is broadly categorized between the 3rd century BC and the 3rd century CE. And this is a period which is seen as a representative of tribal traditions, of polities in certain pockets, of limited agrarian clusters, of some incipient trade and urbanism that was prevalent. But all of this was extremely limited. There was no expansion, there was no transformation, there was no creation of surpluses through which a more complex society could evolve over here. What we have is sources which are referred to as the Sangam literature, essentially poems of love and war, which reflect a kind of heroic society. You have bards who were composing these great poems on war. They were going from place to place. They depended on the munificence of the local chieftains and rulers, and they were rewarded for their compositions with jewelry, with and at a later point of time with land and cows and so on. So this is a very incipient state society that one can see over here. You do not have a full-fledged state society at this point of time. What we also find from the Sangam literature is a social organization where largely we can identify between two classes, those who are the elites and those who are the menial classes, the Uyarndor or the Chandror and the Irichinar. And the poems themselves were essentially about the Uyarndur. They reflected the society of the elites, the concerns of the elites. But it is not as if the Elitianer were absent completely from these poems. They appear in a way as providing a background. So when you have the armies that are passing through the fields, when you have descriptions of the landscape, you have the ordinary people, people who are professionals, who are performing certain tasks, who have their own occupational specificities. You have all of these people also represented. But of course, as I said, their concerns are not central to these poems. So it's a society which has not yet seen a full-fledged class division and a full-scale exploitation of the subordinate classes by the elites. What we also have is a very interesting description in these sources of the religious and cultural milieu. Now, the poems themselves are organized in such a way that they talk about 5 thinnai. These thinnai are the Kurinji, the Mullai, the Marudam, the Neidal, and the Palai. Kurinji, the hilly regions, Mullai, the pastoral regions, Marudam, the fertile river valleys, Neidal, which is the sea coast, then Palai, which are these very dry and arid regions. So these different regions are the setting. So the poetic conventions are very well organized. It's a very high order of poetry that we are talking about. And the Aham and Puram poems have certain rules that if, for instance, you are talking about Palai, then the difficulties of separation, the hardships that are being faced will have to be represented over there. In the Kurinji region, you have the clandestine, the illicit love that is evolving, that is developing, that is to be represented there when we are talking about the love poems. Similarly, for the war poems, also you have certain situations that are given, and the thinnai provide that background, so to speak. So it is in that context that we also understand the different kind of flora and the fauna and the different kinds of communities that are living in these different thinnai. Along with that, we also hear of the different gods and goddesses and of the cultic practices and the rituals that existed at this point of time. Now, what all of this indicates to us, the literature indicates to us, is that while the Vedic sacrifice is known, while the Brahmana is known in the region, while the Shramanas are known, they are not present in any significant manner as to affect the traditions of the Tamil people as shown in the various thinnai. So the thinnai traditions have a certain importance and centrality, and while all these other traditions are also visible, they are not at all dominant. What we have is, in the period from around the 4th century to the 6th century, some kind of a transition or a transformation that was taking place. And this transformation can be understood primarily in terms of what appears to be an agrarian expansion. For instance, in the Tamil epic, the Shilapadihara, you have references to land grants that are being made. You have in some of the later poetry, which as a corpus, we talk of it as Sangam literature, but there is a difference in the dating of the texts that have been put, that have been understood as Sangam literature. So the Tamil epics, as well as some of the poems that have been anthologized, are seen as actually belonging to this period, if not slightly later. So in those works, what we find is this evidence of a very vibrant agrarian culture that is developing, an agrarian economy that is developing. What we also seem to find is new kinds of political formations that are emerging. You have references to the Kadabras. You have who may have been one of the tribal chiefdoms, which was able to exert its authority and enter into the fertile areas, and that is why you have their references in various sources. You have, and these sources incidentally are of a later period primarily, but you also have sources of the earlier period which talk of them, of the contemporaneous period. We have also in these texts, which are dated to this period between the 4th and the 6th, references to Buddhism and Jainism, the shamanic traditions, as having become very important. We find that the urban centers appear to be thriving, and we also find the Brahmanical tradition as becoming quite visible and prominent. And what is also very interesting is, while in the early Sangam poetry, the Thinnai have distinct milieus, in this transitional, in what we call the transitional period, it appears that the different Thinnai are actually gradually being linked together. So the cultural milieus are also getting interlinked. And it is also interesting that the texts of this period indicate to us that some of the local deities who are associated with the Thinnai, they are being identified with Puranic deities. So, for instance, when I was talking about the different Thinnai in the Kurinchi region, you have Sheyon, or the red one, who's talked of, who is identified with Murugan, and Murugan is a very distinctly Tamil deity, and there is an attempt to link him to Skanda Kartikeya, who's very well known from the epic Puranic pantheon. Similarly, you have the goddess Kottravai, who is known to be the patron of the Palai region. And Kottravai is gradually being associated with Durga of the epic Puranic pantheon. So really all kinds of changes, transformations, which appear to be at a very nascent stage, but nevertheless they are conspicuous because of the kinds of descriptions that you have in the text. What we also have is interesting inscriptions, and this image that I'm showing you is of a site called Ulangurichi, where you have descriptions of the kinds of land rights of different categories of persons. So you have the cultivators' rights and the landowners' rights that are being specified. Again, as I said, the texts are already telling us about land grants. What these inscriptions are telling us now is about a more complex agrarian structure that is emerging, an agrarian economy which is predicated on surpluses which can support large populations, which is emerging at this point of time. Ulangurichi is particularly interesting because this is not in the fertile river valley region, but actually in the arid regions that we have this inscription. So the first such instances where you have the extension of agriculture outside of the fertile river valleys and into not such hospitable regions as far as agriculture is concerned, which means the techniques of agriculture also are being developed at this point of time. When we come to the early medieval period, and this is the period where we contextualize the Tamil Bhakti tradition, we find that we are looking at a process of state formation. We have at least from the 5th century, from the late 5th century, the early 6th century, inscriptions which are telling us of the Pallavas who are coming southwards from the Andhra region and are making the northern part of Tamil Nadu, the region that we refer to as Tondai Mandalam, as their core area. They are establishing a state structure. There are institutions of governance that are being established. Similarly, you have the Pandyas, who are known to us in the early historic period itself as important kings, or as an important kingdom in and around the Madurai region, but who are limited to that region. You have the Pandyas emerging with their epicenter still at Madurai, but who are covering a large part of the region, of the sub-region around there, which we refer to as Pandimandalam. At a later point of time, so this is a process that is happening between the 6th and the 9th centuries, and from the 9th century onwards, we have a very important power that emerges, which is the Cholas. Again, a dynasty that is known in the Kaveri River Valley region, but which now emerges as a major state power. They are able to extend their authority over different chiefdoms, which had perhaps had greater control over the Kaveri region, such as the Muttarayar, and by the 10th century, a fairly large region of almost the entire Tamil macro region is covered by the Cholas. And this is the period that we refer to as one of Chola hegemony, one where the Cholas have conquered the entire Tamil region, including the regions that were ruled by the Pallavas and the Pandyas, and where they were also making incursions into other regions in a bid to garner resources and extend their control more firmly through administrative institutions in these new areas. We have, as a concomitant of the Chola state state formation that is occurring at this point of time, from the 6th century onwards itself, agrarian expansion and intensification, and also trade and urbanization, in particular from the 9th century onwards, which is visible in the inscriptions which all of these dynasties have left in large numbers, particularly the Cholas. There are two particular institutions that emerge at this point of time, and they are the Brahmadeya and the temple. The Brahmadeya, or the settlement of Brahmanas, is something that comes up with the Pallava Pandyas, and what we have in the inscriptions of these dynasties is references to large numbers of Brahmanas belonging to different gotras and coming from different areas, being moved to newer areas, settling in those areas, having different kind of specializations, many of them who are associated with Vedic learning, as well as with knowledge of the cultural epics, which are the Sanskrit Ramayana and Mahabharata. You also have other kinds of knowledge, Upanishadic knowledge, that is referred to, Mimamsa, that is referred to as being known by these Brahmanas. So really a major visibility that we have of these Brahmanas and the kinds of functions they perform, the knowledge that they have, that is visible in the inscriptions. You also have references to the temples in the in these inscriptions which are being built. As I said, you have the cave temples and gradually the structural stone temples, which become grander, particularly from the 10th century onwards. Most scholars who have worked on the early medieval period would see the state formation process as reaching its culmination under the Cholas, and what we could call the imperial tendencies of the Cholas, that in the manner in which they tried to conquer other regions and integrate those conquered regions into the Chola state. And that integration is done through many methods, but a very important method that is used is through the institution of the Brahmadeyas and the temples. At a later point, Champak Lakshmi argues that the Nagaram is also used as one such institutional tool, as a nodal trade center. So through these institutional tools, by having special provisions for the creation of these, and through these to route the agrarian expansion and the appropriation of surpluses and various kinds of dues, this is something that occurs at this point of time. It is in this context that bhakti as an ideological tool is seen as very important, because it is through the evocation of the idea of bhakti that there is justification of the expansion into other areas, of the building of temples in various areas, and also there is a legitimation of the king and his right to control this vast region. And there are very interesting studies which talk about how the terms that are used for the king in the palace are so similar to the terms that are used for the god in the temple. The terms that are used for the services for the god are also being used for the king, etc. So very important process that is occurring concomitantly. There is state formation occurring. There are institutional tools that are being developed to allow for agrarian expansion, control over resources, and appropriation of surpluses. And it is through the ideal of bhakti that there is legitimation for the temple and the Brahmadeya as institutions to find a place across the Tamil macro region. So what we have really in this period that we are talking about as the contextualizing of the bhakti tradition is a Sanskritizing of the religious culture. So while we had a religious culture that is known, there are associations that have already been made in the period before the early medieval, but these become more concrete, more definitive, more voluble, more conspicuous in the hymns of the Bhakti saints. And then we also have the localizing of the Puranic tradition in this region. And this is very important as part of that expansion that is taking place, because that expansion also requires integration. And one of the ideological ways in which this integration is done is when the Bhakti saints go to particular sites or sing about particular sites, and they talk about the feats of Shiva or Vishnu at a particular place, which is actually within the Tamil region. So in that sense, they are localizing the Puranic myths. For instance, in the Shaiva myths, you have references to the Attavirathanam. That is the 8 places where Shiva's heroic exploits can be seen. Now, what are these 8 places? They are Tiruvadihai, where he destroyed Tripurantaka, where he took the form of Tripurantaka. So his exploit is of Tripurantakam. Then you have at Tirukandiyur, where it is Brahma Kapalam, where he cuts off the head of Brahma for lying. In Tirupariyalur, he cuts off the head of Daksha for insulting him and for destroying his sacrifice, and then destroys his sacrifice. In another place, he's commemorated for overthrowing the demon Jalandhara. In another place, he is commemorated for overthrowing Gajasura, the demon who took the form of an elephant. In yet another place, he is referred to as killing Andhakasura, his son who dared to lust after Parvati. his own mother. Kamantaka, where he burnt Kama, is at another place. And finally, one of the places that is eulogized by the Bhakti hymnist is for the killing or the destroying of Yama at that particular place. So in these ways, what these hymnists were doing was really they were giving a local home to a transcendent deity. The deity is transcendent, his feats are transcendent as revealed through the Puranic mythology, but he's actually given a space within the locality, within the Tamil region, and in that sense, there is a localizing that is happening. And in that sense also, there is an integration that is happening where all of these sites are being brought together through the devotional hymns as representing the feats of Shiva, as places where one can identify the feats of Shiva as having taken place. And therefore, for the devotee to gain salvation, these are important places to know and to consider themselves to be a part of. Right? So the community of bhaktas that is being created is also one which is looking beyond the Thinnai, beyond the Mandalam, looking at the larger Tamil macro region. You have a large number of bronze images that are being cast and that are being placed within temples and institutionalized from at least the 10th century AD. What we have is in these, I'm sorry, there'll be some repetition in the slides, but I'll just go over, I'll just skip over some of these. But what we have in the hymns is some very interesting motifs. So for instance, in a number of hymns of Sambandar, we have references to this is actually a code that is followed by Sambandar and Appar. Sambandar, Appar and Sundarar are considered the three most important saints of the Shaiva tradition. They are referred to as the mover, and in Sambandar's hymns you have a certain kind of code where in the 8th verse of every hymn he refers to Ravana and the pride of Ravana and how he is vanquished by Shiva, and the same motif is also taken up by Appar. So the epic protagonist Ravana is referred to in the Vaishnava hymns as the Lord of Lanka and how he is vanquished. But in the Shaiva hymns, what is being talked of is how Shiva actually grants grace to Ravana by quelling his ahankara. So these are Ravana anugraha cases of grace being bestowed on Ravana by just pressing one toe down when Ravana in his arrogance tries to carry the Mount Kailasha. So the hymns themselves would merely refer to the toe that is being used to press down and quell the arrogance and pride of the many-headed and many-handed king. But we understand the broader legend, the myth, because of the epic Puranic reference. We also have in Sambandar the description of the Lingodbhava form of Shiva, the cosmic form of Shiva, the pillar of fire, which is described in the Purans, where Brahma and Vishnu could not find the source. Brahma goes upwards in the form of a swan and Vishnu goes downwards, and these two important deities are unable to find the source and ultimately accept the greatness of Shiva. A very important cosmic myth that is there, and this is mentioned in Sambandar's 9th verse invariably. In the 10th verse of Sambandar, invariably you have anti-Jaina statements that are being made. There are references to the crudity of the Shramanas, of their greed, of their voracious appetite. Upper also talks about this when he talks of them as being dirty. In fact, there is a hymn in which he is crying on behalf of these young girls who are coming to offer worship to Shiva, but who have to hide their eyes because you have the Jains who are walking around naked, looking so crude, looking so ugly, and so on. So you have certain kinds of refrains, certain kinds of motifs that are very common in these hymns. In Sundarar's hymns, you have very, very interesting motifs that are there. But something that is quite striking about Sundarar is his reference to himself as the one Tondar, the harsh devotee or the passionate devotee of Shiva, where he also looks at himself as a Thoran, as a friend of Shiva. So something that is elucidated in the Bhakti Sutra of Narada and also in the Bhagavata Puran, where the Sakha Bhava, the feeling of friendship, the offering of devotion as a friend, that is represented here, the Thoran that he refers to himself. But he is not any ordinary friend. He is a friend who can even call Shiva a madman. He refers to him as Pittan. So all kinds of very interesting things that you have in the hymns, which are telling you about the way in which the religious culture is being transformed, the way in which these epic Puranic gods and myths are being made familiar to the Tamil people. These are hymns that are being composed in Tamil, and the same can also be said for the Vaishnava tradition. You have Upper who also talks in the context of Tiruvarur about the different Shaiva sects. He talks about the Pashupatas, he talks about the Kalamukhas, and so on. So you have different kinds of information that appears to be fragmentary because it's barely half a line in which you have these references in a particular verse, but nevertheless they are very, very interesting in terms of the information that they're giving us about the transformation that is occurring, about the Sanskritizing influences that are taking place at this point of time, and how important the Bhakti tradition is to this transformation. If you look at, for instance, as I said, even the Vaishnava hymns have many such instances, and the Vaishnava saints are 12 in number, and Nammalvar, one of the most respected of the Vaishnava saints, he refers in this particular verse to the king of Lanka, and how it is the Lord whom he is worshipping here is the one who kills the ruler of Lanka, and refers to the island where the ruler of Lanka lived and ruled. And Sundarar makes this very interesting observation about himself. And this is something that is very interesting. As I said, what we have as evidence for the way in which the Tamil Bhakti tradition emerges and evolves is not merely the hymns of the saints, but also the hagiography of a later period. So in the Periya Puranam, which is the hagiography of the Shaiva saints composed by Chekkirar, what we have is a full elaboration of this story of Sundarar, who is actually blinded by Shiva for having gone back on his promise. In this particular verse, Sundarar is talking about how Shiva, and then there is this narrative about how Shiva claims that Sundarar is his slave and that he had bought him and that he has a deed proving this, and so on. So it's a very interesting and important story to talk about how great the devotion of these saints was, and how great the benevolence of the gods also were towards those who showed them devotion. So in this particular verse, Sundarar actually refers to some of those instances where he says that he was sold and bought by you, meaning God, by Shiva, and he then says, but you don't need that deed to say that I am your slave. I am your slave of my own free will. And then he says, why did you make me blind? Why did you take away my sight? And give me back my sight, because I am your true devotee. In this particular hymn of Karaikal Ammayar, one of the earliest saints who is dated to about the 6th century, Sundarar is one of the latest of the Shaiva saints who is dated to about the late 8th, early 9th century. In the verse of Karaikal Ammayar, you have a description of Shiva, a very typical iconographic description which we already know from the epic Puranic traditions, of the moon resting on his jatas, of the snake that adorns his body. But she is talking about the dance of Shiva in the forest of Tiruvalangade, a place which is known as an important cultic spot of the goddess, who also was renowned for her dancing. So a very interesting thing that is happening in these hymns is that not merely are they identifying the gods whom they are speaking of or singing of, in a particular place, what they are also doing is displacing other gods or cultic deities who may have had a space within that particular place. So this is something that you find in many hymns, not merely that of Karaikal Ammayar. But what is very interesting is her own description of herself. She talks of herself as the Pei of Karaikal, with burning mouth and teeth, who wanders through the forest and who has sung these verses. Many of these saints talk about how just singing these verses will absolve people of all their sins, that they will attain the feet of the Lord if they were to sing these hymns. Then you have also the hymns of Andal, which are of a different type altogether, personifying what Friedhelm Hardy refers to as Viraha Bhakti, the idea of separation. This is very obvious in the Vaishnava hymns. It is very limited in the Shaiva hymns. The Shaiva hymns are of a different kind. So even within a region, as you can see, bhakti within the two traditions of Shaiva and Vaishnava are expressed in quite different ways. And Andal's verses have in particular been picked up by historians and feminist scholars because of the kind of sexual desire, the eroticism, the unabashed love and feelings that she displays for the object of her devotion. Now I come to a very, very important part. How do we understand the context in which bhakti is gaining a presence in the Tamil land? And what is very interesting for us is that from the 9th century itself, we have the institutionalization of the bhakti tradition through the grants that are being made to those who would be singing the bhakti hymns in various temples, in various places. It appears that all the places that were being sung off by the bhakti saints did not actually have temples at that point of time, because in many of the places you have the natural landscape that is very beautifully, very evocatively described by these saints. But what we have is, by this period, a process in which temples are actually coming up in many of the sites that are sung off by the bhakti saints. And we also have rituals that are being institutionalized where the hymns of the bhakti saints are going to be sung. So for instance, one of the earliest inscriptions that we have of the 9th century is that of Nandivarman III, the Pallava ruler. And here you have at Tiruvallam the description of payment to various temple servants, and amongst them you have the Tirupadiyam Paduvar, the people who sing the verses of the Shaiva saints. You have images of the Tevaram trio, which are instituted in the Rajarajeshwaram temple, the mover, the great saints, that is Appar, Sambandar, and Sundarar. And you also have the image of some other great Shaiva saints like Chandeshwara that are described in inscriptions. Now, Chandeshwara, we don't know of him really until the Periya Puranam gives his entire life story. But clearly, the legend of Chandeshwara is known by the 10th century. And that is what is important about this whole process of institutionalization, that we can see that there is, in addition to the textual presence of the hymns, we have oral traditions where the legends of the lives of the rulers are in circulation, are well known. And on the basis of those legends, you also have provisions and worship that is being instituted in various places. You have all 63 saints who find a place of the Shaiva tradition by the 11th, 12th century in various temples. What we have, again, in many of these inscriptional references, I'm just giving these as general descriptions for you to have an idea of how common this became, how well entrenched the ritualization of the bhakti hymns had become by this point of time. By the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, you have large numbers of records which are talking about the land grants that are being made and payment that is being made to the singers, the performers of the hymns within the temple. So they actually become part of organized ritual and worship, which is very much related to the state's propagation of the bhakti tradition. You have various terms that are used for these performers. So the scholars like Champakalakshmi and Vidya Dahejia and Indira Vishwanath Patterson talk about how there are 3 different stages in which we can see the kind of entrenchment of the bhakti tradition. The first is where the actual hymns are being composed. The second phase is where the performance of the hymns, the building of temples, and the ritualization of the performance of hymns is taking place. And the third phase is when you actually have the hagiographies that are being written, which are providing us with greater details about the way in which the bhakti saints lived their lives, connected the sacred landscape, created a sacred landscape, and the way in which the state itself plays a very important role in propagating the bhakti tradition. So we have therefore references to the Uvachar, the Tirupadiyam Paduvar, we have the Vinnabam Chaivar, those who are making offerings, you have the Arayar in the case of the Vaishnavas, and so on. So a whole range of inscriptions which are talking about this. But one particular inscription is something that I find very interesting, and here I'm going to skip through some of these, which is that you have reference to 16 blind singers of the performers of the bhakti hymns who are given lands. There is a land grant that is made where these 16 blind persons are being given the grant. Yeah, so this is at Tiruvamattur, and this is something that is very, very interesting because generally you do not have information of this kind that comes through in the records. Now, something that that is often asked about the bhakti tradition, and this is primarily because of the influence of the early writings on bhakti from a historical perspective, which has tried to locate bhakti within a feudal background, is that it has generally been seen as a way in which a large community could be created cutting across caste and class, and that this was in a way a false false kind of ideology that was being propagated. In fact, MGS Narayanan, in a very well-known and oft-quoted essay, talk about this as something that was meant to relieve the pressure of caste tensions and stresses. But when we actually look at the hymns from the perspective of the Periya Puranam, because as I said, the proper background of the hymness is something that we get only from the later texts, from the hagiographies. So in this case, I'm referring to the Periya Puranam, but others have also talked of the Divya Suri Charita to have this kind of an analysis. We actually find amongst the Shaiva Bhaktas, you have 63 saints who are talked of. Only 35%, there are 35% who are Brahmanas and 35% who are Kshatriyas, about 20% who are possibly Velala or the peasant caste. There are 5. By Kshatriya, essentially it refers to belonging to a ruling lineage. So it can be, they can belong to a major dynasty like the Cheras. So the reference to Cheraman Perumal or Kulashekara Alvar, or they can be a local chieftain, as in the case of Tirumangai Alvar. So Kshatriya is really a broad term that is being used. Velala, the peasant caste, you only have 5% in terms of the actual descriptions that are given who belong to the lower caste. And even over there, there is some ambiguity as to actually whether they belong to that caste or not, and so on. But at any rate, what we have is also in the case of some, like Andal, we don't know what caste she comes from, because she's found by this Brahmana, Vishnu Chitta and Periyalvar, and brought up by him in Srivilliputturu, and so very reminiscent of the Sita story, that we find these kinds of indications as not really suggesting to us that bhakti was meant to relieve some of the social stresses caused by caste society. In fact, there are historians who, like K. Hanumantan, Noboru Karashima, and others, who talk about how caste itself is something that is evolving at this point of time, while the privileges of the Brahmanas are very well known and established, and there is even some mocking of this in the Bhakti hymns. What we also find is that the full-fledged the caste system as we know of, the caste structure as we know of as an exploitative system, at least does not find full expression in the sources that we have of this period. What we can definitely see is from the 10th century onwards, with an intensification of the agrarian processes and a full-fledged agrarian economy emerging, you have what we can call a very evolved caste society is actually emerging from that point of time. There may be problems with this kind of an interpretation, but certainly the assertion that for the period between the 6th and the 9th centuries, we are really looking at a well-entrenched caste society, that is not validated by the sources that we have at hand. Clearly, when we look at the hymns, what we find is that there is an attempt at the creation of a community. There is an attempt at talking about the oneness of all. There is a mocking of privilege of certain sections of society, but there is no enunciation of caste in terms of its structure, nor is there a full-fledged denunciation of it in any significant manner. There are certainly mentions of caste, but there are also certain kinds of comments that are made which suggest that the depredations of the caste structure had not yet fully got entrenched by this point of time when the hymns were being composed. It is through the institutionalization of the bhakti tradition that we see how and why the importance of the creation of a community of believers, those who were actually able to identify their religion and their deity and godhead in particular sites across the Tamil region, becomes very important, because this is intrinsic to the integrative processes that are being exerted by the state. So it is in the interests of the state to foster, to further the bhakti tradition. And it is in that context that we see bhakti as becoming firmly rooted within the Tamil region. I will stop over there. I have crossed my time limit and I apologize for that, but I'd be very happy to take any questions if there are any from the audience.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for. So, in the beginning, we talked about the conceptualization of bhakti, the ideology of bhakti. So, there's this question by Aravind that according to the philosophy of bhakti tradition, it is stated that there is a duality between the deity and the devotee, and the devotion springs from an admiration of the deity by the devotee. So, is this duality permanent?
Yeah. The duality, at least in the Tamil Bhakti, I'm going to restrict my answers to the Tamil Bhakti tradition and not wander to the way in which, say, in the Bhakti Sutras, this is talked of and so on. But what we do find in the Bhakti hymns is that the duality is very much emphasized, and the Shaiva hymns, for instance, there is this whole celebration of the idea of being at the feet of the deity, of being the dust at the feet of the deity, of being the servant of the deity. And Sundarar, who is the first person to talk about 63 Shaiva saints, including himself, as part of the Shaiva tradition, he actually talks of himself as the servant of the servants. So he talks of the other saints as servants, but he talks of himself as the servant of all those servants, right? So this idea of being servile, of being subordinate, is something that is clearly there in the hymns. However, what is also very interesting is that, for instance, in the hymns of Andal, but also in some other hymns, and here you have some Shaiva hymnists also, like Manikya Vachikar and even Appar, who speak in the woman's voice. So when they speak in the woman's voice as a bhakta, they want to merge themselves with the deity. And in the case of Andal, as I already mentioned, the erotic element is so strong in her hymns, in her compositions. She's actually talking about physical desire and the need for a physical union as part of her communion with the object of her devotion. And similarly, you have in some of the Shaiva saints' compositions where they are talking about this girl who is, who is just finding a way, because all she wants is this physical union with God. So the hymns are talking about possibilities of a union that is complete, where there is a merger, but invariably that completion is articulated in terms of a physical consummation. But largely, when you look at the hymns, you find that the hymnists are talking of attaining the feet of the deity, which itself is seen. So you are coming in proximity to the deity, and in that itself, salvation is ensured. Yeah.
So, you mentioned about the institutionalization of bhakti, the way the temples were emerging. So, there's this question by Ayushman Chakraborty. He asked that the rise of the bhakti tradition also gave rise to the idea of building of temples and shifted the god's residence from private groves and households to huge structures, giving rise to the idea of pilgrimage to the shrines and temple towns. How did these factors affect the trade and economy of the period?
Yeah. Actually, a lot has been written on the impact on trade and economy, and particularly Champaklakshmi's work on temple urbanism brings forth this particular aspect. And other scholars like Heitzman, Kenneth Hall, and so on have also talked about it in the Tamil region. By focusing on specific sites like Chidambaram, Kanchipuram, and so on, to show how these become more and more important as urban centers, primarily emerging because of the temples that are situated here, but also because they're important nodal centers in trade networks. So both of these aspects are referred to by various scholars with reference to various sites. But what is very important, I think, and I'd like to pick this up from the question, is the idea of pilgrimage. Now, the saints, by talking about particular sites and saying to others, exhorting to others that they must also come to those particular sites and experience the greatness of that divinity at that particular site, they are actually paving the way for pilgrimage as a practice that is institutionalized. Yeah. In the Tamil region, by the 11th 12th century itself, we have what are called the Sthala Puranas, which become very important, where each of these sthalas actually develop legends around them. And sometimes, and very often actually, these sthalas are not looking at only the sectarian traditions, but you have multiple traditions that are brought together to talk about the greatness of a particular site, right? So you can actually have different gods, different cults, different practices that are also being talked about, and legends are being talked about with reference to a particular site. So the Sthala Puranas are really a clear evidence of how pilgrimage is very important, and that this is something that is a result. The Purans themselves are a result of the importance of pilgrimage in society at that point of time. So pilgrimage is something that is certainly being exhorted by the saints. It is something that would have also become more viable once you actually have temples being built in these various centers, because as I said, in a number of these places you don't really have temples, and there are places which are referred to as the Padal Petrasthalams, the places where the hymns were composed, meaning that there is a site and a hymn is composed over here. The poet, in his mind, in his imagination, in his mindscape, is visualizing the deity, housed in a temple at that particular site. And the temples are then being built by the rulers, and they're being embellished and expanded, not just by the rulers, but by other affluent classes over a period of time. So certainly pilgrimage is something that becomes easier, more viable once the temple building activity gets this kind of an impetus, where the state itself, as the major builder and the upholder of the Padalpetra Thalams, is coming forward to build these temples at these various sites. Yeah.
So you talked about the caste and gender in bhakti towards the end of your lecture.
Mm-hmm.
What was the reason, the main reason behind huge participation of the people from all social backgrounds, whether it be from the royal or from the farmers?
Now, how these are questions that will always have a little bit of gaps in the answering, because obviously we are limited by the kinds of sources that we have. But clearly what we have is the idea of bhakti in the form of expression of devotion to the godheads of the theistic traditions of Shaivism and Vaishnavism emerges because of the circulation of ideas, circulation of myths and legends and so on. And it is in that context that you have these various saints who come from different backgrounds, who are captivated by this idea, and who come under the influence of this idea, and who are composing the hymns in honor of Shiva and Vishnu. Having said that, did they actually meet each other? Did they influence each other? What was the nature of influence? We do get some evidence of this from a lot of evidence of this from the Periya Puranam, where we are told about saints who meet each other. So there is this this particular narrative about how Appar, the elderly, that's why he's referred to as Appar, meaning the father figure, and Samandar, this boy saint, how they meet each other, and both of them are so full of awe and reverence for each other that both fall prostrate at the sight of the other. So you do have these instances of them meeting each other at particular sites. You have a mention of of those who accompany one of these great saints when he is going on his peregrinations. So you have these kinds of instances that are there in the later texts. But from the hymns themselves, there is very fragmentary information, and that is certainly one of the limitations in terms of actually providing an exact answer. But it is obvious that ideas, anyway, one cannot really pin down how they get to influence social groups. And when, for instance, you are in proximity to the exponents of certain ideas, it is through that proximity that you would be influenced by those. And it is in that sense that we need to look at the way in which these saints get to become adherents to the bhakti tradition, how they become proponents of the bhakti tradition. Yeah.
So there's this question by Malvika Binni. She asked, Tirupan Alvar talks about him living on the outskirts of the city, not being allowed to see the face of the deity, so using drums made of hides of animals. So can we not argue that some of the caste conventions had indeed fallen into place by the time?
As I said, certainly there are indications, instances of some of the practices such as those who are considered to be outside the social pale, those who are considered to be untouchable, etc., as having already emerged. But how influential or how pervasive was this? That is a question that I think we also do need to ask, because we are also talking about the time period when these hymns were composed as one where their own movements seem to be restricted to certain regions, to certain specific areas, largely within the riverine areas, the areas where you have the possibilities of agrarian expansion, where the state is able to intervene and encourage that kind of agricultural expansion. But the nature of expansion that is occurring at this point of time is one where we cannot still talk about that kind of a deeply entrenched and widely pervasive caste system. So certainly there are references, and this is, as I said, one should not ignore those references. On the other hand, whether one can use those references to argue, as Veluthat and Narayanan have, that the Bhakti tradition or the Bhakti movement, as they call it, can be understood as really some kind of a stress buster to relieve the stress. And they use these expressions, incidentally, to relieve the stress that is cooking up. And that is building up to a high pressure. I'm not at all sure that for this point of time it would be correct to see this as something that that would be wholly valid. Certainly, one can see from the very fact that there are very few people from the lower castes within the caste hierarchy, those who are considered outside the pale of caste, who are part of the Bhakti tradition. We can see from that itself that there are certain limits that are being posed. What we also find is in the hagiographic accounts, even though there is this acceptance of the greatness of the so-called lower caste saints, what we also find is some kind of finality and closure of the lives of these saints after they undergo some kind of trial by fire, literally and metaphorically. And this again suggests that we can't look at the Bhakti tradition so simplistically as to see it as relieving the society of its pressures, of its caste pressures. The issue of women, of gender, of the 12 Alvars, there is one woman whom we have. Of the 63 Nayanars, there are 3 women, and only one of them has any real presence and has any real influence as far as the Shaiva tradition is concerned, and that is Karaikal Ammayar. The other 2 is the wife of the Pandya king, who is given a place because she helps one of the great Shaiva saints convert her husband, the Pandya king. Mangayar Karasiyar is the name of the lady. So she helps him convert her husband to Shaivism. So that is her greatness. That is her claim to fame. The other woman saint who is included in the list of 63 saints is the mother of a great Shaiva saint, that is Sundarar, Isenyanyar. So it is, a very limited presence that you can see as far as women are also concerned. And I have written about Karaikal Ammayar as well as on Andal, and many others have also, like Vidya Daheja and Professor Vijaya Ramaswamy, who unfortunately we lost a few days ago, a few weeks ago. But one of the most evocative writings on these women saints is by Vijaya Ramaswamy. And while these women saints were very influential, particularly at a later point of time, once the institutionalization of the bhakti hymns as part of temple ritual occurs. For instance, Andal's hymns are very important to the Sri Vaishnava tradition and so on. But what is quite significant is that the life stories of these women saints do not leave us with any clear indication of how they were actually able to overcome the limitations of the gender differences, except by making certain immense sacrifices. So in the case of Karaikal Ammayar, who is described as a very beautiful woman, a married woman who's performing all her wifely duties, because her husband abandons her, she's a beautiful woman in a society which would look upon her in a very negative way because she's abandoned. So what does she do? She gives up her physical form. That's what the legend tells us. She makes herself so ugly. She starves herself so that her bones are showing. And in the spirit of bhakti, we are told that this is primarily because she now sees herself as having only one family, and that is the family of Shiva and Shiva's Ganas. So she wants to become one of Shiva's Ganas. That is why, because these Ganas are all very ugly and horrific looking and so on, she also takes that particular form. In the case of Andal, what happens? That she is found by the Brahmana, who is the flower maker. She's called Kodai, the flower garland. What she does is she commits a transgression in the sense that the flower garland that is made to be offered to the god, she wears it every day because she has fallen in love with the god. And so the legend goes on about how she decides that she will marry no one else but that god. And finally, when she's admitted into the presence of God, of Vishnu, she just disappears into him. Right? So what all of these stories are telling us is that, yes, bhakti does seem to provide space for those who are marginalized within societies, like those from the lower castes as well as women. And you also have, in the case of Tirupad Alvar as well as in the case of Nandanar, similar kinds of stories where there is a closure which is very unsettling. It is something which does not really suggest to us that there is a questioning of social norms. And that is why I would argue that although they are extraordinary people, these saints, leading extraordinary lives, extremely creative, having this wonderful felicity with words and describing the God in so many different ways, they are also very much within the normative framework. And that is why we find a certain kind of closure that is written in when they are perceived within the narrative structure as having transgressed either because of their own desires or because of social pressures. Yeah, I'll stop with that.
So this will be our last question for today's interaction. So I think this question will require another lecture. But you mentioned about the association between local deities and the Puranic ones. So how did you see the rise of Bhakti tradition led to the rise of various goddess cults?
Yeah, well, I have a PhD thesis on this. And I have a monograph on this, and certainly not one but several lectures could be used for discussing this particular aspect. But one of the things that I have argued for, and I mentioned this very briefly, is that we have references in the Sangam poems and the Sangam literature to a goddess called Kotravai, who is the patron of the Palai region. And by the late Sangam itself, that is the texts that belong to what are called the transitional period, we have in the epics, for instance, descriptions of this goddess in many ways, in different forms. And gradually you have the complete association. It appears with Durga, with Kali, with Chamunda, and so on. So in the hymns of the Bhakti saints, you have, for instance, references to particular feats performed by the goddess in the Sangam poetry, which are now ascribed to the goddess who is known by the Puranic name, the epic Puranic name. There are various such instances, but I have particularly referred to the issue of dance and how the goddess as a great dancer is something that comes up. And because in the Shaiva tradition, Shiva is the great dancer. And you have, number of hymns, every saint almost who has talked about the dance of Shiva, every one of the great saints of the Shaiva tradition, Appar, Sundarar, Sambandar, Manikyavachikar, all of them have talked about the dance of Shiva. So it's in that context that I have tried to argue how there is a marginalization in two ways. One, in the way in which the motif of dance, which is associated with the goddess and her hosts, the Pei Mahar, that is transferred to Shiva, who is the object of devotion of these Shaiva Nayanars. But something else that they also do is certain cult spots which were known to be the abodes of the goddess. For instance, the goddess is often referred to as living in the forests, as being in dark, inhospitable places, and so on. That these are the sites where the Bhakti hymnists are seeing the dance of Shiva. So what are they doing? Not merely are they taking the motif of dance, they are also taking the arena of dance and making that the arena for Shiva's dance. So it's in that sense that I have argued in one way that we can see the displacement and marginalization of the goddess traditions. But I have also tried to argue that that what we are looking at is the Brahmanical perspective. What we are looking at is one worldview or one way of understanding the divine and the religious and cultural milieu. And it is possible that the traditions never actually get marginalized or die out. And this is obvious, particularly when you see from the 11th, 12th centuries onwards, a number of shrines to goddesses that are coming up. What we find is that the goddess is now being given a space primarily as the spouse. So while earlier the association is mostly with Durga or Chamunda or Kali, now you have the association that is being made, another jump that occurs where the association is being made now with the spouse of Shiva, which is Uma Parvati. And it is in that form that you have these shrines that are coming up. But again, the Sthala Puranas, as well as fragmentary references from a variety of sources from an earlier period, as well as from contemporary times, indicate to us that these are very ancient cult spots of the goddesses. Many of these are ancient cult spots of the goddess. And it is in that sense to commemorate those cult spots, but to also integrate these local deities and divinities that you have these temples that are being constructed and the goddess being brought within the ambit of the Shaiva pantheon. Actually, it's much more complex and complicated than this. But in my understanding of religious process, we can identify certain patterns. But to definitively talk of a shift, which means an erasure, is something that we need to be careful about. And particularly when we are looking at the Brahmanical influences and the way in which the religious cultural landscape is changing in early medieval Tamilaham, a very important reason for that visibility is the state's role in giving visibility, in giving this conspicuous space to the Brahmanical traditions. This does not mean, however, as was once understood by several scholars, that other traditions didn't exist. We know that the Jaina traditions continued to flourish for a fairly long period thereafter. Maybe not to the extent that they were flourishing in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, but they were not wiped out, they were not erased. So we need to be a little more careful and cautious when we do look at religious traditions, particularly because our sources direct the way in which we look at these processes of change. But the contextualization is important because it can direct us towards why a certain religion or a certain cultural practice becomes very conspicuous and visible at some point of time. And that is where I would see the state in particular and the kind of institutionalization of the Bhakti tradition that occurs that gives Bhakti such an important presence in the Tamil region.
So thank you very much, ma'am, for this wonderful, very insightful lecture this evening, which was followed by a great and very beautiful, post-lecture discussion. It was such
Thank
an
you
honor
very
for
much.
me to be moderating this session this evening. Thank you very much, everybody who joined us live, and we look forward to opportunities in future as well for another lecture by you.
Thank
Thank you
you
very
very
much.
much. It was my pleasure to be a part of this initiative. Thank you.